I think we're probably about ready to get rocking and rolling here.
Okay.
So, Jim, why don't you take a stab at introducing us?
I'll introduce myself. I'll let you introduce yourself. I have nothing fancy to put on the screen, but my name is Jim Hutchinson. I work at the Larimer campus. I'm one of the instructional designers. I'm actually tied to the TAA grant for the clean energy program where they're moving courses into hybrid and online. And I also teach part-time at a couple of schools out in Greeley that I won't mention so I don't offend anybody. So I'm kind of bringing my background from instruction and assessment into this particular presentation. We're going to talk a lot more about the why of assessment and rethinking how we run our assessments to use them more as a learning tool rather than a grading tool. Not that you can't still grade with assessments, and we're not saying that that's not something that you would do. Just that, especially with an online tool like D2L, the opportunity is huge for running assessments, for using formative assessments as a way to really enhance the learning experience and have students focus less on their need to cheat or do well on an online quiz because it's part of their grade, and more on really asking the question, am I learning, am I understanding? And if not, where do I go from there? So that's kind of a brief summary of where we're going with this today. Kristin, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. So I am Kristin Rivedal. I am the LMS coordinator college-wide, which just means I'm the D2L gal. But beyond just being your tech wench, I am also an instructional designer based out of the Westminster campus. And so I work on primarily online course developments and have my master's in adult education and instructional design. So, it's one of those things that we don't often get to pull on in what we do in our presentations, but we're really excited to be able to talk to you about some instructional items and pull in technology to support it as needed. But we definitely are here to talk more about why you would do certain things in a given class and why you might not. So I see at least one person, Glory, has posted an answer that she's had on the first, the difference between formative and summative assessments. We've got one response on that. Anybody else have any thoughts on that question?
Well, that's either a no or they're busy typing. So. So I'm going to go ahead and back up just one slide here real quick. I have to go through all the steps. There we go. So did everybody see the title page for this?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, perfect. Not getting any feedback. Sometimes it's hard to know if I'm talking to myself or if everybody's still out there or not. Down at the bottom, that says the link to the detailed presentation. If you want to go ahead and take a moment to just jot that down, that will get you to pretty much everything we're going to look at today. But I've included some extra information in there. Not, rather than just read those slides to you, giving you the opportunity to go in and look at those if you should choose to do so. Everything that we're going to look at today, I believe, is in that presentation as well. Plus, there's other information in there. So, yeah, it looks like Brandon posted it to the chat. So, I'm going to jump over to our agenda real quick. And the first thing we'll do is we'll talk just briefly about the quiz that we had you think about and why we had you think about that. And and we'll look at how that quiz might have been presented in a more, we'll call it traditional format. We'll talk a little bit about the whole idea behind formative assessments and using them as more of a teaching and learning strategy, a way for students to be more reflective on their learning, more metacognitive about what they're learning and understanding or not understanding. I have 3 examples of, again, we'll call them traditional quiz type questions, and how those could be reformatted to be more of a higher level and informative type assessment. We've got one from English, one from math, and one from science, to hopefully hit a few different disciplines and just show some examples. And then the big question at the end of this will probably be, great, but the types of assessments you're suggesting look like a lot of extra work for me as an instructor. And it doesn't have to be. We've got some suggestions at the end on how to really, how to manage what could be perceived as extra work, how to manage that. But more importantly, how to really shift the learning back to students as part of the whole process. So it shouldn't result in more work for you as an instructor. Ideally, it results in more work and more thinking, especially for the students. So that's kind of where we're going. So here's the original questions. I'll just pull those back up again. And my comment there was just, hopefully these types of questions versus that type of a question would encourage you to be more thoughtful, more reflective. What exactly is the difference between formative and summative assessments? So here's sort of the alternative type quiz question. I mean, if I was doing this as a quiz, this would be one approach, just simply A, B, C, D, which is just the correct answer. Anyone want to take a stab at it? What's the correct answer from this particular one? You could just hit A, B, C, or D. Okay, what we got there? If I can read it.
Lori's got one.
Yeah, that was B, have an impact. Ideally, formative assessments, which, if you weren't sure, formative assessments are generally assessments that occurred as part of the process, the learning process. So if you were thinking in terms of, say, a week-long or a month-long unit, formative assessments would occur at multiple periods during the unit, maybe one early on, one a little further in, and one a little further in, and they would be used primarily to help students assess whether or not they're really understanding what it is that they're being taught. If they don't understand it, it's an opportunity for them to go, well, yeah, I don't understand that. What should I do about that? And then take steps to correct or to fix their understanding or their lack of understanding. It's also an opportunity for instructors to identify areas of concern. Students are not understanding something. Many students are not understanding it. Then that's an opportunity for instructors to modify their instruction as they're going, rather than waiting till the very end of a unit, giving a summative assessment, something that happens at the end of a unit or even a course, giving a summative assessment at that point and go, oh, wow, 80% of my students failed the test. Well, we're too far along to go back. Formative gives you a chance to fix those. And one of the criteria of formative assessments is that they tend not to have a huge impact on grade. In fact, you might not even grade the assessment, a formative assessment, based on correctness, right or wrong. You might only grade it giving points to students for having completed it. It's the act of engaging in that formative assessment that's important, and then of course reflecting on it rather than a level of right or wrong. I'm going to try and tune into or Kristin, if you want to summarize the conversation as we go in the chat box.
Absolutely happy to. I suspect that the only comment that's been added in there is a hooray to the comment when I mentioned that spelling doesn't count to affect their grade in the chat. So I think we're doing well so far. But yeah, you folks, I definitely am keeping an eye on the chat, and we will pull that teacher moment of just going silent if we're waiting for you to give us an answer. So, just so you know, when we're like quiet and it's awkward, we're waiting for answers. We want you to participate.
This one was, again, just another part of the conversation today is what do we really mean when we're talking about understanding and assessing students' understanding and giving students the opportunity to evaluate their own understanding. So one of the questions was, what is understanding? And I think there's probably as many answers to that as there are people, because everybody might take a different perspective on that. The idea, the answer that I thought was the best among these would have been B, the ability to transfer knowledge, because that's really what we're talking about, rather than knowing the correct answers about something. It's the ability to take your understanding of some piece of knowledge and applying it, evaluating it, synthesizing that information, creating new information or ideas from that knowledge. So the ability to transfer it would really be what we're mostly talking about here. And then the third question that we had, the idea of cheating, especially when in online assessments, where unless you're going to run it as proctored, and even proctoring doesn't guarantee students can't or won't try to cheat. But if it's not proctored, then it's an open book test. Students have the ability to search the web. They have the ability to call friends, to chat via IM, text each other. I mean, there's so many different tools available to allow students to essentially collaborate on a quiz. And if you are intending to use quizzes in a summative manner for grading, then there's going to be a lot more potential for students to want to do that. And that's where we need to be a little bit creative, especially with our summative assessments, in preventing students from cheating, or providing outlets that sort of minimize the importance of cheating. And formative assessments are one way to do that. There's not a whole lot of value for a student to cheat on a test that has little points, or where they're being graded simply on completion rather than correctness. And we'll get to, at the end again, we'll get to some strategies on how to use formative assessments in a way to encourage that learning process and discourage a desire to cheat. So in this case, what I thought would have been the correct answer when I wrote this up as just a practice or a sample was that the idea, using proctors wouldn't necessarily curb cheating. Students may still feel the need to try to cheat, especially if it's a high stakes and high point value assessment. I just saw I'm fading in and out.
Yeah, sorry, that was actually a private message to you, but yeah, your voice just occasionally sort of fluctuates in and out. So I'm just wondering if it's a mic issue where you're facing it or not facing it.
I don't know. I'm just using my laptop built in. Maybe I'm covering it by accident. I'll try and be a little more careful of that.
Sounds perfect. It's not bad. We can still hear you. It was fading in and out just a touch.
Yeah, maybe the mic's on the front of my laptop here, and as I rest my arm on the keyboard, I might be covering it.
Exactly. That's when you get muffled.
Okay, got it. I'll try not to do that. So on the question, the difference between formative and summative assessments, this was one quote that we found that could be a possible answer for the difference between a summative and a formative. The idea that formative is something progressive. It's along the way. It's an annual checkup where the doctor can say, wow, it looks like your cholesterol is high. What should we do about that? Likewise, in a classroom, while your learning is not great, your understanding is not great, what can we do about that? With summative assessment, and in this case being the autopsy, where they say, wow, he had high cholesterol, maybe that's why he died. And that's not very useful to the person who's having the autopsy done. Likewise, for a student finding out at the end of a course that they failed the final exam or something, it's a little bit late at that point to go back and say, what could I have done different in order to do better in this course? So there was just one interesting quote that we found that somewhat humorous that we thought summed it up pretty well. So I'm just pausing between some of these to give you time to think or to post comments in the chat if you choose to.
It looks like Shannon had a question in the chat. She said, interesting example. Do you find this to be the case even when summative assessments are, say, weekly?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Which example?
Oh, I was just the autopsy example. I was just thinking of that kind of being like maybe an end of the semester type summative exam. But what if the quizzes are weekly just on each unit? Is the feedback that we give on those still kind of dead in the water or not applicable to students?
I would say it's kind of yes and no. I mean, if the quiz is carrying any weight in the course and doing poorly on the quiz, it is feedback. Oh wow, I didn't do well on that. I could think of my daughter's math class, for example, not doing well on a math test or a quiz is good feedback, and I need to think more about that. But it's also a grade in the book, so it's already a mark against you. And if you have the opportunity, one thing that the Poudre School District, I live in Fort Collins. One thing the Poudre School District has adopted or is attempting to adopt is the idea of standards-based grading, where getting a poor grade on any assessment isn't a grade in the book. It's an opportunity for students to go back, reevaluate their learning, for teachers to reevaluate, and then give students a chance to retake it. And that shifts it back to the learning again. When you've learned it, then we're going to move on. So yes, I mean, you could use weekly quizzes as a way to give feedback to students. I mean, obviously they do that every time a student takes a quiz or any assessment. It's a form of feedback. The potential downside is, do they care? I mean, at the point that it's a grade in the book, oh wow, I didn't do well on that assessment or that quiz, too late. So if you offer the opportunity for students to retake them, or if the quizzes are worth very little, again, kind of more of a formative type quiz where students can say, wow, I didn't do well, correct that misunderstanding or lack of understanding before they get to a summative quiz or test. So yeah, I think it just depends on how you want to run those.
Nope.
Hopefully that helped.
Did, thank you.
I'm not hearing.
Great. So anyway,
sorry, hang on. We've got somebody in the room who's trying to ask a question. I'm not sure her mic is working. Let me make sure it's unmuted. Otherwise, it's. I'm not hearing it. All right. We may have to have you type it, but or I can repeat it. What's your question? Okay. Okay, so the question is, Dido is here, and she has weekly quizzes that are worth 50% of the overall grade, and so she's thinking about allowing students to do those more than once. She's thinking twice at this point in time, and so personally, when I hear that, that suddenly becomes a very high stakes quiz. What are your thoughts on that, Jim?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if quizzes are 50% of the grade, then they are effectively summative. They're testing whether or not students have already learned whatever content they're being quizzed on, and they're being graded on those. Nothing that we're saying today is to suggest that that's not an okay approach. You can certainly use any sort of assessment as summative. In fact, you have to. I mean, there has to be some level of summative assessment in order to say at the very end, did a student meet the goals that we expected them to meet, and did they earn the grade and the credit for the course? But the idea here is that even if you continue to use those quizzes as 50%, is there a way to provide opportunities for students prior to summative assessments, as they're working through a unit or a chapter or whatever it is however you have it broken up, opportunities for them to assess their own learning, their own understanding, and have those assessments not be graded in the sense that they're going to take a hit on their overall course grade. In other words, it's okay to get answers wrong. And in fact, it's better to get answers wrong. I mean, a wrong answer is a clue to a student that they don't understand something, and it's an opportunity for them to adjust and correct, seek out help or other information prior to coming up against some level of summative assessment. So yeah, I mean, I think that's
okay. Hang on
a
just
way
a
to go
second.
about
She's got a follow-up question on this here. Okay. Sure. Right. Okay. Well, right. And so she's saying that in a perfect world, she would be able to have folks go through a lab. And so, you know, I think we're going to touch on this before we finish up here. But again, it's the what is sustainable, what is a realistic goal for an instructor to be able to do in the class, I think is the basic point of what we're looking at here. And so I think we're going to come and hit some answers that are some possibilities here as we move forward. But definitely, we definitely understand you're teaching multiple sections with multiple enrollments, and it's definitely sustainability is a legitimate concern.
Yeah, and that's precisely what we're going to look at the very end, is a way to shift that workload off the instructor and onto the students, so that they become more responsible for their own learning, their own understanding, assessing their own learning and understanding, and of course taking measures, taking steps to address that, and not just sitting back and waiting for the teacher to provide everything for them. They just need to remember and answer the questions at the end. So we're trying to shift all that to students, ideally to improve learning. So let's just take a quick look at a couple different examples here from different content areas on sort of the typical or traditional type quiz question that might appear, particularly in an online quiz. Of course, all these things can be done in class. There's nothing that says this has to be done in an online environment. The quiz could be given in an online environment and then the discussion brought into class. The quiz itself could be given in class with the discussion in class or the discussion online. I mean, there's multiple approaches. So we can talk kind of that at the end, but just in general, here's a typical type question, maybe from I can't remember the number, but the Dev Ed English class. It's a 0 something class. You know, this might be a typical question that you would see in a quiz where students are just asked to remember or recognize even the correct usage of commas in this case. And if we think about Bloom's, which I don't have an image of Bloom's right here, but Bloom's taxonomy, we're really at the very, very bottom of remembering or understanding level. Do I remember what commas go? Do I understand at this level? And one of my frustrations with Bloom's is that use of understanding at the very bottom level, when Bloom also said that understanding was really what happens when students can apply and evaluate and synthesize information, which is the top level of Bloom. So that's a little bit of confusion, I think, in how we use that particular word. But an alternative type question would be something along these lines, where students are actually asked to create the question. So it's not a matter of recognizing a correct answer. It's a matter of, can I apply commas correctly in a sentence? Obviously, if you shift it this way, then the instructor is, at least the implication is the instructor has to go in and grade these. Again, we'll get to this at the end. You do not have to grade these. Students can do these types of assessments without shifting the burden to the teacher. So that was an English example. Here's a math example. Fairly straightforward type question you might see on a math test. Again, it's just asking students, do they remember, in this case, the Pythagorean theorem? Do they remember how to apply it? I had a math when I was teaching elementary school. Actually, took a course on teaching mathematics, and the teacher referred to these as naked numbers. They have no real meaning. It's just it's just numbers, numbers without units. When we attach units to numbers, we're talking about X number of feet or something. Suddenly they have a little bit more context and more meaning. So these are just purely naked numbers. And then an alternative of this is this particular question, which I actually took from a study that was done in the 1970s. Essentially better teaching of physics. And they were trying to assess students' understanding and their misunderstanding of concepts related to force, the physics of force. And this, I think, was one of the very first questions on that. And questions A, or answers A and D, are actually examples of misconceptions. So if students answer, if many students answer A, for example, then the instructor would know that there's a specific misconception that's happening or lack of understanding as to why they answered that. Same with D. It's another specific type of misconception. And the particular study that this came from, they have a whole list of all the different types of misconceptions and so forth. We don't need to go on that. But it's an example of a higher level type question. Students would need to understand more than just the Pythagorean theorem. They would need to know that you need to apply the Pythagorean theorem to calculate the answer. So one, there has to already be a level of understanding there to know, how do I find the answer before I can go through and just do the mathematics to find the answer. And then a science example.
Somebody taught me how to say that word 2 hours ago, and I can't say it now.
Yeah, I remember that. We were there. I was there. In any case, again, it's a recall type question. Can the student recognize from the list of answers which answer is the correct one? It doesn't even necessarily require that they know the right answer. Like if you'd ask them without giving them any hints, I mean, the A, B, C, D are already a list of hints. All they need to do is recognize which one's correct or recognize which one's not correct. We talk about test taking strategies for students taking the SAT or the ACT, and what are the wrong answers? Weed those out and go from there. So again, an alternative to that would simply be a more of a short answer. Describe, explain. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that word. So the obvious or the potential question at this point is, great. So all you're really saying is stop giving multiple choice tests and do a lot of these essay questions. In a way, partly, I think it's difficult to do multiple choice tests that really do help get at the heart of understanding. I mean, the math example was one that I think can do that, and I think well-crafted questions can do that. But yes, I mean, it's more the intent. And just because you're doing essay questions doesn't necessarily mean you're really getting at that deeper level of understanding for students. And just as you can do a multiple choice question that does. So it's really thinking more about how you're assessing, what you're assessing, and what process you're going through as you're creating and delivering the assessments. A lot of it is in the delivery and the setup of the assessment. So just a couple of points about formative assessments. I guess I should say formative assessments, not necessarily just quizzes. But first, there's the issue of timing. And we want to make sure that we're giving students these formative assessments at multiple times throughout something, that it's happening early enough for students to understand or to recognize that they do not understand something, and give them time to correct that. We know that the more authentic these types of quizzes or these types of assessments are, the better, the more engagement there is from our learners, especially with adult learners, who many of them have jobs and or at least some aspect of their real life that if they can apply it to that, they see more value in it. And then finally, that idea of not using formative assessments as some sort of punitive assessment. If you didn't do the reading, you're going to get a bad grade, therefore do the reading. It's really more about the learning, what learning is happening or not happening on the part of the student, and using the assessment as a way to make them aware of that. So in other words, there's value in going through the process of the assessment, and it's not as important whether they get right or wrong answers. It's important that they go through and spend some time to reflect on why they got right or wrong answers. So the idea of grading these quizzes as done versus not done. And that's one, that right there is one way to minimize the level of teacher work that has to go into the grading of these. If students simply get full points for taking the assessment, then that can be automated. Once it's done, they get full points. We'll go into a little bit more of that in just a second. I'm just pausing for a moment to see if there are any questions or to give you a chance to look over that screen at the moment. Sorry, I think I covered my mic right there.
We can hear you.
Okay. So
nothing new in chat.
Yep. Okay. People are coming home now, so if my dogs start barking, I apologize. So some of the alternative ideas that we've come up with as ways to use these formative assessments. Hold on just one sec. I apologize. I'm going to mute my mic for just a second. Kristin, do you want to talk briefly?
I'd be happy to. Of course, you catch me at the one moment where I'm choking on myself. It's definitely one of those things. We've heard everybody, I go through running these sorts of sessions often enough. All you have to do is tell somebody, oh, multiple choice, not so great. And they're like, but I don't have time to grade all of those quizzes. And I totally understand that. And so the suggestions that we've come up with here are just some ideas that we had brainstorming, but you can have a D2L quiz that incorporates the actual feedback that allows students to do it as self-assessments. And so, if they get a wrong answer, you can set up that quiz. So it's got feedback with, oh, if you answered this, then here's why that answer is not quite correct. And ultimately, the student is graded on whether or not they do the quizzes, not necessarily on the grade they achieve on the quiz, although you could also do that with multiple attempts. And maybe you get your highest score on it, but feedback on the wrong answers offers some hints towards what would be the correct answer. Oh, if you answered this, go back and review the section on XYZ. So that would be a way that you could have that be less, more of a formative approach. We've also got the option of using a follow-up discussion for students. And so everybody goes in and takes the quiz. And then when they get their feedback, okay, now go into the discussion and post one or two questions that you got incorrectly. And then other students come back and say, oh, I got it right. Here's what I answered. And that way they're actually discussing the material, which is always a thing that you want to get them to do. And in a classroom situation, hey, make sure you take the quiz the night before class and come into class prepared to discuss two questions that you got wrong. And you put them in small groups and have them work together that way. So that isn't just a face-to-face answer or online answer. It could also be face-to-face.
Just to jump in there real quick, Kristin, I was going to point out that the idea of doing that, of having the students bring in those wrong answers, shifts the students, hopefully their perspective a little bit to say, you know what, it's okay to get wrong answers. And in fact, it's desirable to get wrong answers. And therefore, that idea of I need to cheat or I need to spend time to just copy and paste or to really find right answers becomes really a waste of students' time. They realize that there's no value in doing that, and that the real value is in not what they got right, but what they got wrong, and what can they bring into class and discuss.
Right. And I think Brandon has a really good question, which is, how do you motivate students to participate fully in formative assessments without punitive grade-based incentives? How do
Well,
you
I
get them
think
to do that if it's not part of their grade?
I think what you can do, I mean, you can still offer points for these types of assessments, but again, it's not grading, did you get all the answers right or not? It's did you do it? Did you take time to do it? So we're grading the attempt and the completion of it. And they are getting points for that. So therefore, again, there's no pressure to get everything right. There's only pressure to go in and do the assessment, to participate in the process. And then you could also attach these to a discussion thread where the students, whether it's in the class or in the online environment, bring those questions that they got wrong into a discussion and participate in the discussion and grade the discussion. Give them, the quiz points that they would have got for doing, if it's a 50-point quiz or something, well, now it's a 50-point discussion and you're getting points for participating in the discussion, not points for getting everything correct on the quiz itself. So there's still accountability. Students are it's still necessary for students to participate, but it's not about the right or wrongness of their quiz grade or their quiz questions. It's their participation in the process that becomes important.
Right. And I just want to hit that there's a couple of things coming up in the chat, which is Lori's a fan of the group idea, small enough to be safe if it's wrong, if you've got a wrong answer, but collaborative enough to benefit. And then Lisa was mentioned, how about giving a grade on class participation, which I think is the same as equivalent to giving the grade on the discussion. And so absolutely, I think that's a
I might even break that down a little bit and, rather than, I use class participation as sort of a effective, I use it as a summative grade. It's 10% of a course grade is the level they participated in the course. But I think it might be, in this case, you might want to break it down and give them class participation on a daily basis, if it's an in-class activity, or at least a weekly basis if it's a online discussion, and that they're getting points for participating at that level rather than sort of a summative class participation. So that I just want to try to clarify those two. The last item on the list here, the create small groups. I think this is an interesting approach that one requires a bit of a shift in really your teaching style, at least at some level. And the idea here is whether this is happening in class in a face-to-face environment or in an online or hybrid, I don't think it really matters. But that you're turning over some of this formative assessment to students themselves to actually in groups on, let's say, a weekly basis, for example. This week is group 1, next week is group 2, and so forth. And each group has to process the content themselves. They have to come up with formative type assessment questions. They have to deliver them to the students, the other students in the class, which may require some assistance from the instructor in an online environment. The instructor may need to create the quiz with their questions. I'm not sure we can have the students do that. And then the students would run the follow-up discussion as well. They would be the moderators. So when the students who took their assessment go into the discussion and post, I got this particular question wrong, why did I get it wrong? They're moderating. The other students are answering, and then they're following up as well and saying, well, we thought this would be the right answer because this is what we were going for because, and let the students really facilitate that whole thing themselves with the instructor sitting back and really just providing the overall structure, the overall environment for this to occur in, as well as being a moderator and providing feedback as well. Students say, we thought this would be the right answer, and the instructor says, no, that wasn't the right answer. Here's why everybody's wrong. Being still the authority there, but letting students take on a lot more of that responsibility. Again, shifting the workload away from the instructor so that the students become more involved and more deliberate in their coursework and in their understanding of their coursework. So that is my last slide. That's really where we were going to wrap this up, with some suggestions on ways to rethink how quizzes are used, or any form of assessment. It doesn't necessarily have to be a quiz, but that is the D2L language. How to rethink these and how to reevaluate how they're being delivered, how they're being graded, how the points are being assessed, and so forth, to give you some alternative ideas, ultimately to hopefully increase student learning. The more opportunities they have to reflect and address misunderstanding or lack of understanding prior to any summative assessment, I think is only going to help overall their understanding.
And two things I want to bring out here. First of all, we have created a Rethinking Quizzes course shell, and everybody who is in this session, as well as everybody who's registered for it college-wide on all of the different sessions, is enrolled in that course. And so our first initial quiz is in there, but I'm also going in right now and making a discussion. So if you come up with questions or thoughts beyond this today, and you want to add, post a discussion and continue the conversation outside of this WebEx, go and look on your student tab for a course in the spring 2014 semester under a training department called Rethinking Quizzes. And then because it's got quizzes in the title, I feel obligated as D2L gal to offer, if there's any specific questions on quiz setup that you have, I'm happy to go through some of that. But of course, this was posed as not necessarily a technical discussion. So if we can help you with anything, let us know.
Kristin, do you want to take it back real quick and just walk through that example that we did in the face-to-face one?
Sure. Let me steal the beach ball. So hang on just a moment. I'm in the midst of, I'm even going to allow anonymous posts on this discussion. There we go. All right. So there's a discussion thread set up in that course now if y'all want to post messages. But one of the questions that had happened earlier this morning was, how do we put feedback in a specific place where students can see it? And let me now share my desktop, which is less scary than it might have been. But, and I'm going to now ask both Jim and Brandon to keep an eye on the chat window since I am not there. But on any given kind of quiz, if I'm going into the one I had set up here earlier, if I'm adding a question, and we talked about being able to do multiple choice questions that offered feedback on, for example, the wrong answers. So I'm going to come in here and add a new multiple choice question. And Jim, your microphone is still open if you want to mute that while you're typing.
Sorry.
No problem. I just hear ticky tappy tap. All right. So we've got my questions here, and I would come in personally, set my options on quizzes. I like to randomize options so that I can always put my right answer in first. This is a very fuzzy answer, and I would never really do this on a quiz, but I don't write quizzes so often that I'm very good at writing answers. But you can use this feedback box in quizzes. So somebody give me an answer that's not quite close on how you could encourage students to participate in, well, let's see, we already said this might not be. This is kind of contrary to the concept of formative assessments. And I could offer feedback on this question that was, anybody else notice that you can't type and talk at the same time? And so I could start using this feedback area on specifically incorrect answers to point them in the right direction and give them hints towards what might be a better option for them. And that way, if they have a second chance to take this quiz, they can come back and will have to have looked at what the correct answer might be. And I could continue that down on all of these. Also, overall, there is overall question feedback, and anything I left in this bottom feedback box would be given to every student who took the quiz, and it would be feedback that they would all see. So no matter what answer they gave, you could give some general feedback on
Kristin,
this.
can you scroll back up for just a quick second?
I can.
I was just going to point out, this is a good example of going back to that math example, the cannonball question, where if you have designed your questions to specifically try to identify when there's a misconception, then, if answer A is a specific type of misconception, then the feedback can be, I see you are misunderstanding this information because of whatever, and you might want to review the information in your text or Google this particular word, or, you can give them hints to say, this is why you got that wrong, or this is likely why you picked that answer. That doesn't account for guessing. I mean, if the student got it wrong because they guessed, that doesn't necessarily help, but they still know why. They still know that it's wrong, and they still know that they're being given a guide to where the correct information would be, or how they can get that information.
So that's one way of using that feedback on questions.
And this works in long answer questions as well, correct?
Yeah. Yes.
You can give feedback. Students, if you're asking students to write, a sentence with the correct usage of commas, a correct example can be given as feedback, so that after the test is completed or the quiz is completed, they can go back through and self-grade. Did I get that one right? Does my answer look like the one the teacher provided? And then they have to apply a little bit. They have to look at the question, their answer, and the example of a correct answer, and make an evaluation. Is my answer similar in its correctness to what's provided in the feedback? Again, just encouraging that higher level of reflection and thinking through the assessment tool.
So just to show you on a long answer question here, you've got the option on how to make that text box. The answer key is a nice thing to include if you've got somebody other than yourself grading questions, by the way, because it displays as you're grading it with, here's what they should have had included, is, if you've got 5 keywords or something. But here's where, if you go in and take this quiz, you'll see this question feedback after you take the quiz on the long answer question. And pardon me, I'm going to pop out of where I was editing that question also. The one other question somebody had was, what do students see after they take a quiz? And that's handled in quizzes by submission views. And you'll notice that the default view is that immediately after they take a quiz, they don't see the questions and they don't see, all they see is their score. And so you can either set up an additional view that says, on a formative view, what you're going to see is, yeah, I'll show them the question. I'm going to just show them questions they answered incorrectly. And I'm going to show them their score. So I'm not going to show any answers. I'm going to leave that deselected. I will maybe show their score. And that way they see just the questions they missed. They know they missed them. They'll see the feedback for those questions. You could actually show all questions with user responses and still not show the answers, so students could verify that they did get the correct answer.
Or you can actually show them the correct answer and give them that opportunity to self-evaluate. Did I get it right or not? So the choice is up to you. Is it important for them to have the right answer or a right answer upon completion? Or do you want them to bring, well, they got it wrong, but they don't know why they got it wrong. So they're going to bring that into the discussion. And I think those are all valid approaches. It just depends on what it is you're trying to accomplish with that particular quiz.
Sorry, and I'm just making a quick change here to answer Jan's question about, does this work with multiple attempts? And yes, you can do it so that either the number of attempts they've taken doesn't count at all, or you only get this after you've tried 5 times or after you've tried 3 times. So you can either set it so that they get this view after every attempt, or they only get it after a certain number of attempts. Also, this is kind of interesting, limit the amount of time for which this view is available after the quiz is submitted. So you can only look at this within 20 minutes after having taken the quiz.
I will point out that that doesn't necessarily work if they can take screenshots.
Oh yeah, yeah. There's always ways around this stuff.
But the idea being that, you know, we want them to go in and look at what they got wrong and why they got it wrong. Think about that, but not be able to continually refer back to it as part of a discussion, that they need to start thinking on their own and not just parroting what the teacher said. So that would be, you know, one way to do that would be to give them a small window of opportunity to go and look at what they got wrong and what the teacher suggested might have been the right answer. And
I would also point out that the screenshot, oh, let me take screenshots of all of this. If you've set it up so that it's, in fact, we've hit all those, why are we going to encourage them not to cheat? Because it's taking the quiz itself, getting it right on the quiz itself is not such a big deal as it is to show learning.
Right.
Then they're not going to be so motivated to try and take the screenshots.
Right.
Did we have somebody else trying to speak? Sorry, I just heard some muffles on the sound and didn't know if we were getting somebody else trying to.
It's really windy outside my house.
That must be it. All right, well, we're coming up to our 2-minute warning here. And does anybody else have any questions, thoughts, comments? Brandon, do we have an online evaluation for this session?
I don't believe we have one set up, but I know that the survey is in SurveyMonkey if you guys would like to send that out. I believe that it's completely set up that we could do it for this particular one, yes.
I think it'd be nice. We got evaluations this morning, so if we continue the trend and do evaluations of all of our sessions, we'll know whether or not it's actually worth trying to not be the techie people for occasions. We like being not techie on occasion and talking about those things we spend too much educational time working on.
Okay.
So yes, if we could send out a survey.
Absolutely, I'll look into it and make sure we get on that.
Okay. All right, folks, we'll go and have a happy Tuesday. Cheer for your favorite team and favorite sport on the Olympics, whatever that is.
Yes, thanks everybody for attending.
All right. Well, we're getting some good formative assessment here. We're getting some good
feedback. Yeah.
It's formative because we get to run this at least once, if not twice more, before the week is out. So it's formative assessment for us, even though it's summative to you because you're all done with it. But please do come in and post during the into the discussion. If you have further questions or ideas, I'd love to build up some ideas that folks have on this after the fact.
And of course, we're always available. So I'm not sure exactly where all the emails are.
You
but they're
know,
out there. So if you want to ping us and ask us any questions, or
we'll put our names up in a news item in the course.
yeah, there you go. If you want help rewriting questions, or you've got an idea and you want to bounce it off somebody, that's what we're here for. We're the instructional design team, so we'll help you design your instruction. So feel free to ask or share anything, or just use this as a brainstorming session.